He has wiped out by his grace through faith in Christ your every sin, past, present, future.
Christian hedonist is somebody who says that my greatest joy, my greatest good is God. And therefore, I will pursue that joy and I will pursue that God above all else. So God's glorified and I'm satisfied.
You are now listening to the Pastor Discussions Podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 52 of the Pastor Discussions Podcast. I'm John, and this is your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life. So this week, we had a power outage in our office. So the power company decided that they were going to shut everything down. And so we were without power for the better part of a day, which kind of scary how much progress and work that halts. Anyway, Carly and I went to visit her family for Christmas, and so we had planned on recording while the power outage happened. We went to our backup mobile recording setup, and for some reason that wasn't working. So we had planned on getting some content together for you guys for today. However, due to the power outage and our inability to get some stuff together for you because of Christmas plans and everything else, what we're going to do is we are going to bless you guys with some material from Brian Croft. So Brian visited us here at Arbor Drive, was it like 3 months ago, and taught at the Converge Cultivate Conference that we hosted, and we recorded that audio. So this is going to be, I think, a blessing to all of you, especially if you're in ministry, but also if you're not in ministry, if you're a church member, church attender. This is going to be a great, I think, encouragement to you as well as you think through church revitalization, church health, and different things like that. Before we jump into that, let me just real quick say we are part of the Bar Podcast Network. You can find more information about the Bar Podcast and listen to more great biblical content for your ear holes at thebarpodcast.com. Also, check out resurrectioncoffeeco.com. Help the church planting efforts going on up there in Avondale, Chicago, and get some great coffee at the same time. And also, if you want to find out how you can help train pastors that don't have access to formal theological training in Mongolia and around the world, go to johnhawkins.net/Mongolia, and you can find out more information there. I'll be going to Mongolia in February of next year and be training pastors there in Mongolia. So really excited about that. So other than that, I don't have really anything else. So we're going to play this clip from Brian, and then next week we will be back with another episode of the Pastor Discussions Podcast, your weekly conversation on doctrine, faith, and the Christian life.
Well, good afternoon. Good to see you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's a real privilege. I've gotten to meet some of you, and I just want to reiterate what John mentioned, that I'm here. I've been asked to come and speak, but I'm also here I just want to meet you. I want to hear about your ministry and hear about your life. And so please come find me. I'd love to just talk with you and get to meet you and just hear what's going on in your life and ministry. So just know that I'm here to be available in that way for you. And I'm excited already to hear about what's going on. I was standing in the hall where the young man who's getting ready to go to Togo was presenting, and I saw that and I asked him after, it's like, when are you going to Togo? We have missionaries we sent to Togo 10 years ago. And I said, I need to connect you with this family there. So we're all doing the same work, aren't we? Wanting the gospel go to the nations. And so that's exciting to hear about what's going on here. And so I've been asked to come. I heard church revitalization is the big buzzword now, isn't it? And so, but I was doing church revitalization before it became a buzzword. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. But it is certainly a great need. In my circles in Southern Baptist life, there are 1,000 churches that close every year now. And so it's an epidemic in a way that we've never seen before. And we also know that all kinds of other denominations, Baptists and others, are struggling in the same way of churches just slowly dying and closing. And we want to try to make gospel be a gospel light in these communities through these churches that have been there a long time. So I want to also talk today and then tomorrow on this idea of perseverance, as that seems to be one of the big hurdles with church revitalization, because in case you didn't know, church revitalization is hard work. It's tough going into a church that's struggling, dysfunctional, problems going on, conflicts that have existed for a long time. And somebody's got to go in, though, and to try to figure out how to help a church move forward. And so perseverance is kind of the theme of what I'd like to focus on for our time today and tomorrow. I want you to think about for a moment what you could accomplish in 2 years. I mean, think about the things that we maybe can accomplish in 2 years. I've had friends that have lost 50 to 100 pounds when they really work hard at it in 2 years. I know people that have written books in less than 2 years, and people who have gone to get master's degrees in 2 years or less. If you think about it, there's a lot of things we can do in our life in about 2 years' time. And yet when it comes to pastoral ministry, especially in regard to church revitalization, I got to be honest, there's not a whole lot that can be done in 2 years. So what I find myself commonly say is, as I've been a pastor for a couple of decades, and I work with many pastors that go into churches, I often say that 2 years in regard to church life is just enough time for that pastor to realize what a mess of a church he just took. And 2 years is also enough time for that church to realize what a mess of a pastor they just got. And I'm convinced it's at the 2 year mark where that's where the real work of ministry begins. And the work of church revitalization actually really begins. And it takes about 2 years just to get to that point. But here's the problem. I'm watching pastor after pastor go into church revitalization, hard established churches that have maybe been around a long time. And pastors go in expecting to see real progress in 2 years in that church. Just like it would happen if you were working on a master's degree or trying to lose weight. The phone call or the email that I get commonly all the time, you'll be thankful, no, this was not the call that John gave me, but I get this other kind of call or email a lot. And that is, a pastor contacts me. He's usually 18 to 24 months into his pastorate, and he says this. He says, I'm getting beat up in my church. Nobody likes my preaching. My wife is done being here. I'm discouraged. And the enemies in the church have just come out of the woodwork, and some of them were actually on the committee that hired me. And they say, I'm ready to resign and leave. And then they say this, tell me why I shouldn't. Now, you can try to salvage those moments, but obviously I'm not able to do a whole lot in those situations. And I've concluded in many cases the reason the average stay of a pastor is 2 or 3 years, 3 to 4 years is still kind of the average, is this, that pastors expect to see real progress in a church in 2 years. And when that doesn't happen, they think something's wrong. And so they bail and go to the next place. And unfortunately, then carry the same expectation to the next church that they just left with. Well, my aim, at least for some of our time now, is I want to present a different paradigm to you. If you've come even with that expectation and you're struggling on understanding what God's doing in your church 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in, I have a different paradigm I want to present to you today. It's one that helps you see that 2 years is just enough time to actually establish yourself in that church and begin to earn the trust of the people. 2 years is just enough time to get to know the people and to know the things of their lives. This is a paradigm I'm convinced that that we need to go and commit a minimum of 5 years at a church, or we don't go, because we'll harm the church if we leave sooner than that. I want to present a paradigm to you today that when you go to the church and the enemies show up eventually and the wolves rip off their sheep's clothing and you see who the adversity is in the church, it's actually a sign to stay at the church, not leave the church. I want to advocate for this in a passage that's a bit different than we would normally look at, I think, in regard to pastoral ministry, but it's tucked away at the end of 1 Corinthians. So if you have a Bible, would you turn to 1 Corinthians and turn to chapter 16? 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And I want to remind you that the Corinthian church, we're in good company, right? That was a mess of a church, wasn't it? The Corinthian church was a mess. Paul had said a lot in 1 Corinthians leading up to this last chapter. Now, I want to recognize, I know there's a lot of pastors here, so hopefully we don't have this attitude, but there's a lot of people who think we get to the end of Paul's letters in the New Testament and he starts dealing with a lot of housekeeping things, and I'm traveling here and say hello to this person, and we think it's not as significant. We kind of skim over the last part of the letters. We think the meat's gone. In fact, I didn't see this passage in this way before until I preached through 1 Corinthians in our church a few years ago. And when I did so, I noticed this golden nugget of profound truth about church life and pastoral ministry that is wrapped up at the end of this letter that is so helpful and essential to see, I think, about even church revitalization, this particular work. So let's begin reading in chapter 16. I'm going to read verses 5 through 9. So if you'll take your eyes there, I'm going to read that for us. Paul writes, "But I will come to you after I go through Macedonia. For I'm going through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time if the Lord permits. But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. For a wide door for effective service has opened to me, and there are many adversaries." So Paul is explaining here to the Corinthians of his travel plans and why he hasn't come to them just yet. It's important for us to see it isn't because he didn't want to see them. And that would be important for Paul to point out, I think, at this point. If you read through 1 Corinthians and you're one of the Corinthians and you get to 16 and you read all the hard things that he just said, if I was a Corinthian, I would be thinking, I don't think Paul wants to come. He's just saying all these things that we're trying to show us the things we're doing wrong. It would be hard to see. Paul would want to even come be with us. But Paul wants to remind them at the end of this letter, no, I want to come see you. I care for you. But he can't come to them yet. He says, we notice that. He desires to come to them. And look into verse 7 even. He even wants to come and hopes to stay longer with them. But there are still two reasons he gives why he feels that he must stay where he is. So there's two reasons Paul stays. I want to take a few moments and look at this in the text. The first reason Paul stays is his work is not done yet. His work is not done. Paul has this genuine desire to want to see the Corinthians, but apparently his work is not done in the current location. Look at verses 8 and 9 with me. "But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door for effective service has opened to me." So Paul had plans, but because God revealed to him of the divine door of open ministry to them, that he needs to stay in Ephesus where he is and finish the work that God had for him there. Notice at the end of verse 7, he says, "If the Lord permits, I'll come to you and stay a while." Even Paul, there is this trust that God in his sovereign plan and providence will get Paul where he's supposed to go. And until that time comes, he wants him to stay where he is. So Paul says the work's not done yet, so I have to stay. But there's a second reason that Paul says he has to stay, and that's this. He says the presence of many adversaries. Did you notice that? "Be assured where the Lord is mightily at work, building his church and his kingdom, the enemy is prowling like a lion looking for someone to devour." That's 1 Peter chapter 5. And this is apparent to Paul in his follow-up phrase that he says after he mentions that open door of ministry in Ephesus and why he's staying. Look down at verse 9. He says, "There are many adversaries." What we need to see here is the point is that if we choose to do the things that God calls us to do, if we walk through that open door of ministry that God gives us where the gospel hasn't been preached and now we're coming to preach the gospel and there's going to be light that pierces the darkness because of that, friends, there's going to be enemies waiting right there. And if the enemy has held a stranglehold on that church or that community, for decades, and you all of a sudden go there to preach the gospel and to preach the word and love and shepherd those people, do not think for a moment the enemy is not coming after you. And the pastors who contact me who are ready to resign after about 2 or 3 years in ministry, so often it's because they finally met the adversaries that the enemy placed there in that open door of ministry that they walked through. And ironically, in so many of these cases, their confrontation with these adversaries against the gospel and their ministries in the church, it makes them conclude what must be time for the next place then. But I want everybody to take your eyes to verse 9. See that Paul takes the opposite approach to that. He says the presence of adversaries makes him conclude that he must stay longer. So for Paul, the adversaries in that place of ministry is actually the indicator that God's at work. And so often we think that means God's not at work because I have the adversaries against me. But no, Paul's saying that this is what tells me God's at work. There's still more for me to do, and therefore I cannot leave. So he stays. I met the adversaries at Auburndale Baptist Church when I went there 15 years ago. I met them just 3 months into my pastorate there. So whatever that honeymoon thing is people talk about in the first year, I didn't get that. So let me tell you a little bit about my church. I took a Southern Baptist church of about 30 elderly folks in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. The church was in financial shambles, and the building was falling down around us, and it was probably 2 or 3 years from closing. The church hired me at a salary they couldn't pay me for longer than 6 months, which I didn't realize until I got there and saw the numbers and saw that that was the case. There were 3 different movements to get me fired in the first 5 years at the church. The first effort was 3 short months into my ministry. I inherited a staff person, a music leader, who had boasted that he had gotten rid of the previous pastor and quickly let me know that when I got there. And 3 months in, he decided to try to do the same with me. Now, you need to know that I was taught well by my mentor. You go in and you preach the word and you love the people and you try to win your staff and your leaders and work with what you have and you don't change anything. So that's what I tried to go in and do, and tried to win my staff, and this particular leader tried to just bring him in and win him. But about 2 months into being at the church, some people started visiting the church, and the church had not had visitors for a long time, probably just checking out the new pastor or whatever was maybe the reason. And I looked up and saw this music leader was going to those visitors and talking to them. And so I was encouraged by that. I thought, one of my staff members is going to these people and welcoming them and greeting them and seeing that they're visitors. And I was real encouraged by that. And I just left it alone. That went on for a couple weeks. And then one Sunday after, there was one of the visitors who came to me and said, Pastor, I just feel like you need to know this. Your music leader came to me after the service and told me that this is a terrible church and this new pastor is crazy and you don't want to come here. So just encouraged us to leave and never come back. Now, I'll have you know, I am not a church growth expert. I'm pretty sure that's a bad way to grow a church. So I had to do something. As much as I didn't want to create a conflict, I had to go and address this issue. And he, of course, did not take that well. And through this confrontation, he declared war on me and begun to try to get a group together to get rid of me, to call a meeting because we're congregational, and to get enough people to vote to get me fired. Now, this is a longer conversation I don't have time to get into, but I was able to find some leverage with him that I was able to then sit down with him and say, this isn't going to work. You need to resign and do so quietly and peacefully. And he agreed to do that. Again, that's a longer story I don't have time to tell. But he resigned at 3 months and left quietly. And in the process, there was a single man that came to the church just to check it out, who heard about what was going on and came and saw what was happening and wanted to just come and help and do whatever he could do to help the church. And when this person resigned and left, this other person happened to be very musically gifted, was theologically sound, and he stepped right in to that music role and took that spot seamlessly the next week. And he had the same first and last name of the previous guy. That was my first 3 months. And when that happened, I was a bit intrigued, wondering what God might be up to in this church. We saw a slow numeric growth in the first year by God's grace. And in a Southern Baptist church, even if the leaders dislike you, if you make the church grow numerically, you can stay out of trouble pretty well. So that's what I was able to do. But about 2.5 years in, I poked a bear I didn't realize was a bear. And I sat in a deacon's meeting, and this is 2.5 years in. And I had not said anything about this before, but I just asked them, I said, we were about 40, a few members had come in, we were about 40 or 50 folks at the church at that time. And I asked the deacons, I told them, as a pastor, I take Hebrews 13:17 real seriously. It says that I'll give an account for each soul that's under my care. And so I asked them, there's only about 40 or 50 of us here, but why is there 750 people on the membership roll? And just to put it out there for a conversation. And it was a very touchy issue that I did not realize as much. There was one deacon that showed to be a very wise man. He didn't say much. He had health issues and things, but when he spoke up, everybody listened. And in the midst of that conversation, he looked at me and pointed his finger at me and he said, Pastor, your honeymoon's over. 2 weeks later, I went on vacation. I went to Minnesota. Most of my wife's family's there, and I was up there. And I had an associate who had come to help me with this work who had called me. And I remember I'm standing in my wife's uncle's field where there's a bunch of cows. It was the only place I could get a cell signal to be able to have a conversation on the phone. And he explained to me that they just called a meeting as deacons while I was gone. And that their plan was to remove me as pastor while I was gone. If my associate would help them, they would make him the pastor when I was gone. And you need to know something about my associate. He was a second career guy, a friend who just wanted to get some ministry experience, thinking he was called in the ministry. He drove a truck for 20 years. He had no college, no seminary, no ministry experience, wondering if he would ever be able to serve in a church. And here these deacons just dangled my job to them while I was gone. And he said no. And then he left the meeting and called me. And the trust that grew in that man, that I had towards that man, is hard to describe to you after that happened. And so because he stood against them, it stopped that process of that happening. And I was able to come back from vacation and actually still have a job. I didn't go on vacation a whole lot, though, after that. And funny story, 15 years later, I'm actually still trying to burn through the vacation that built up all those years. I stopped going anywhere, not knowing what was going to happen. But the worst firing attempt came in year 5. This is a firing attempt that almost split the church and just imploded it. It was over a leadership structure that we were trying to change to. And that became the main issue. But I'm convinced still that was not the main issue. Here's what the main issue was. In a congregational church where a few families held a regime on the church, a stranglehold on the church for about 4 decades, all of a sudden, in the midst of some people dying in the church and a slow group of new members came into the church in 5 years, all of a sudden, the folks that had come into the church under this new direction and vision that I wanted to see for the church, they were the majority. And in a congregational church, they have the authority. And that happened before that other group knew it. And once they realized it had already happened, and they panicked and came after me in full force. That's what I think was the real issue in year 5. And one of the low moments was a beloved church member died. The visitation's taking place at a funeral home. And you know the kitchen in the funeral home where the family's able to go and get, a break and eat some food and get a break from going back and forth from the visitation. There was a meeting called in that kitchen at the funeral home. It was packed. And the meeting was to vote down at the next meeting, the next business meeting we had, to vote down the motion for the leadership structure change. And then when that was done, somebody else would then present a vote to remove me, and they would vote me out. And the plan there was also to bring in, find as many of those people who are still on the membership roll who hadn't been to church in years to come in and vote, so they would have enough votes, since they didn't have it in the normal group that was there. I got wind of this 2 days before the meeting, and I went to the ringleader, and we had an interesting meeting the night before. And I sat down with him and I said, I have the votes for this, and you know I do. But we're going to split this church and implode it if we do this. So I'm going to take this motion off the table. I'm not going to put it forward. If I do that, will you agree to back off so we don't harm this church anymore? And I had no idea what he'd say. But you know what? He agreed, and he even seemed a little thankful about it. But I didn't announce anything about it. So we had our business meeting the next night. Packed room. You might be amazed. I saw people, I'd been pastor 5 years, saw members I'd never seen before. Maybe I should have done it sooner to find them. The meeting started, went through the basic business. I said nothing about it. Went through everything, and I stopped and closed the meeting out and dismissed. Didn't say one word about it. And people left bewildered and confused, and people came for a fight, and there was no fight. And I didn't put the motion forward, and I backed off. And that was at the 5-year mark. And I did two things as a result of that after that. I did two things. Number one is I had a real big fat pity party for myself, because I had been there 5 years, laboring really hard, trying to just survive. Been teaching in the Bible for years about how there's supposed to be pastors and deacons, and we have certain roles, and these are the roles we're supposed to play, and trying to put that forward to the church. So I had a big pity party for myself. I felt like a big failure 5 years in. Almost felt like I had nothing to show for it in my lowest moments. The second thing I did. For the next 9 months, I went to every single home of every person who said they had problems with what we were talking about doing. And I sat in every one of their homes and asked them what was the problem, what was their hang up with this. And I learned so much from them. Found people that weren't against it that they said was against it. I was able to communicate, help understand what the confusion was and clear it up for them. But I'll be honest with you, in the midst of that, after all that, I almost left. I was having heart issues because of the stress and the anxiety that all the conflict had brought for 5 years. I had doctors I was having to meet with. And I was very discouraged. 25% of the congregation left over that still. So the damage was done, and some of them were close friends who had actually come to the church to support me in the work we were doing, who had been poisoned by that other side. So I was discouraged, and I almost left. I get asked often why I didn't leave. Two reasons. Number one, there was just a morbid curiosity, I have to be honest with you, of what was going to come next after all that. I mean, what could possibly come after all this? But a more important reason, a more significant reason why I didn't leave still, was I was haunted by Hebrews 13:17. It says, obey your leaders, submit to them, because they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. And God taught me one of the most important lessons in ministry in that dark, low moment. And that was, I will give an account for the souls of these people, and that includes the people who don't like me very much. So I stayed. My wife was up for staying, and that mattered. But you know what happened? Some of them stayed too. And what happened in year 6, the ship just turned. Mysteriously, it's almost like God took us through that storm to then just turn. and go forward. And the church thrived from that day forward. So what I want to share with you for the last few minutes is I learned 5 important lessons because I stayed. These are 5 lessons I would not have learned had I not stayed. And I want to use them as a source of encouragement for you that if you've come wondering if it's time to throw in the towel or you don't see how God can work, I want to share these with you and see if these may resonate with you as I'm able to look back after 15 years and see that what God had done. So here's the 5 lessons. Number 1, the epiphany of patience. The epiphany of patience. In the early years, I would have told you that I was the one that was being patient. You know, I'm trying to take care of these people and preach my heart out and learn to preach and they're coming against me and there's all kinds of different ways they're being mean and hurtful. And I remember convincing myself, man, I am being patient just staying here, enduring all this. These people don't know what I'm trying to do to try to help them. That was the first 5 years. You know what happened the next 5 years? I started to see things that showed me that these people were actually being patient with me. You know, you get 7, 8 years into your ministry. Hopefully you look back at those first few years of preaching and like, ooh, you had to sit through that? I started looking back and seeing the mistakes that I made that hurt people. I started to see ways these people were actually being patient in ways I did not see in any way in the first 5 years. The way that I came into a church where there's some really long-time faithful but really wounded saints who were there, who were trying to figure out how to trust a new pastor young enough to be their grandkid and missing that, and yet them being patient. There's one lady that I want to tell you about. Her name's Betty. She's 90 now. And Betty's the only one who used to come to me in the first couple of years and tell me that she hated my preaching, but why? Which was helpful because other people said they hated my preaching, but wouldn't tell me why. Actually, they'd send others to tell me they hated my preaching and they wouldn't tell me why. Betty was different. Betty came to me and said, I don't like your preaching, and here's why. And I sat and listened. And I want to tell you, I dismissed everything she had to say. I mean, she doesn't know what she's talking about. You know? I mean, she doesn't preach, you know, and she's heard a lot of different preachers, but probably heard bad preaching most of her life. And, you know, just, there's no way she knew what she was talking about. She didn't understand what I was trying to do. You know, I'm trying to do expository preaching. It's the first time this church has ever had that. And she doesn't understand what that really is. So I dismissed everything she said. For the next 8 years, I went on this interesting journey with my preaching where I was trying to figure out who I was as a preacher. And there are different points where I just didn't feel good where I was. I didn't feel I was connecting with people. I didn't feel like people were engaging with me and they were listening well. And I just became displeased at different seasons. So I started pushing myself. I was reading some books. I was talking to friends, getting evaluations from other people in the church, just telling me how to grow. And I took some risks in preaching and some things started to show that they were being helpful to people. And I was seeing myself grow in my preaching and was being encouraged with that as I went along. At the 8-year mark, 8 years after my talk with Betty, it dawned on me. I had just changed everything that woman told me to do. Everything she told me at year 2 is what I had eventually changed and grown to do. And I had no idea until I looked back at that moment and realized that she was right. And by the way, Betty loves it anytime I tell that story. So I have to go back and make sure she knows I told that story again, because she loves it when I tell that story. I'm going to talk a little bit about Betty tomorrow, but she has become a dear, dear woman to me. And she's suffered a lot. And we have this very sweet, warm relationship now. In fact, she came up to me that Sunday after I preached. She came to the back and she hugged me. And she usually has tears in her eyes because something about the word moved her in the sermon, and she'd tell me about it. This is the woman that went from hating my preaching to usually greeting me in tears because the word had helped her so much. And she suffered so much, and I walked through all of it with her. And she came up to me Sunday and hugged me. And she said, I'm 90. I've had a lot of pastors, but you're the only one I've really loved. If I would have missed that moment had I not stayed. It just took 10 years. But I stayed. And those are some of the sweetest moments for me every Sunday. Which leads to the second lesson. The sweetness of tough love. The sweetness of tough love. I think we all go into churches hoping that everybody's just going to instantly receive our ministry. But come on, is that really going to happen? And do we really want that? Do we really want to go into a church and everybody thinks we hung the mood and hangs on every word we say? That's not going to happen. We know that. But do we really want that? And miss the sweetness of having to try to win people with our love and our investment in them over time. Some of the most rewarding relationships I now have at the church, there's not many left. Most have gone to be with Jesus. Are the people who were there in those early years and even came after me, who stayed, and now I have this warm, loving relationship with. The man that led the charge, the man I had the meeting with at year 5, who was leading all of this charge that was going to just implode our church. That man served me communion last week. That man greets me every Sunday with a smile and a hug. And he says, Pastor, how you doing? He asks me about my family every Sunday. Now, if that doesn't speak to the redemptive power of the gospel in church revitalization, I don't know what does. And I would have missed the sweetness of tough love, of having to try to fight and grind to love people who do not love you yet. And when you win them after years of pursuing them, there is a sweetness to that relationship that does not exist with those that loved you from day one and continue to. And that's a special, unique thing that only happens, or primarily happens in something like church revitalization, where you go in and you're ministering to a bunch of wounded sheep for whatever reason. And God uses you as that healing mechanism in their life. And when you win them, they will follow you anywhere. So the sweetness of tough love I would not have learned had I not stayed. Number 3, the discerning perspective of scars. The discerning perspective of scars. As I celebrated 15 years, and there's not many left that have been there that long, I'm reminded I have a perspective from the scars that I have from our church experience that gives me a perspective that the new seminarian who came to the church 2 years ago doesn't have. So when the new seminarian comes to me and sees that there's like 8 or 10 people on the membership list that don't come to church as often as he would like, he wasn't there in year 7 when we finally voted off 550 people at one time off the membership roll because we spent 3 years trying to find them and couldn't. He wasn't there for any of that. He wasn't there for the deacon that pointed his finger in my face and said, your honeymoon's over, just because I brought it up. He wasn't there for any of that. So I got to be honest with you. The 8 to 10 don't come to church as much as I would like, but are on the membership roll, isn't as big a deal to me as it is to him. Because there's a perspective. It doesn't mean I don't care about that. I do. There's just a different perspective I have that he has no idea about. And there is a perspective, there's a wisdom, there's a discernment, there's an insight that God gives us with the scars that he lets us gain from what we walk through. And that benefits our churches. We have to stay to do it. Number 4, I learned the inevitability of suffering. Just in case it needs to be said, if you became a pastor or you married a pastor and thought that you would be the exception and it wouldn't be hard and you wouldn't suffer, let me encourage you to maybe go find another occupation. Not another pastor if you're the one who married him, but you know what I mean. Don't be a pastor if you don't think suffering is going to be a part of this. It just is. I mean, we have placed ourselves on the front line of spiritual warfare. Why would the enemy not target us if he can come after us and if he takes us down, he takes down our church, our family, and the gospel we preach in one fell swoop? Why would the enemy not tenaciously come after us? So I'm convinced that pastors and missionaries are on the front line of that spiritual attack. And if you have come into a church that for decades has not made the gospel clear, there's no spiritual life there, it has a bad reputation in the community, and you come in and want to change that, suffering and adversaries are going to be a part of your ministry. But it's okay. Charles Simeon, after a long 40-plus year hard ministry, said this to pastors. He said, brothers, we must not mind a little suffering. So there's going to be suffering, but you know what? It's okay. Because of the fifth lesson I learned, the last one. I learned about the steadfastness of the chief shepherd. The steadfastness of the chief shepherd. The chief shepherd never abandons his under shepherds. And that needs to take root in our souls as we do this work, especially when it feels like everybody's against us. I hope we preach all the time that the chief shepherd never abandons his sheep. I hope you preach that in your pulpits regularly. And I hope you believe that. Let's assume that's true, that the chief shepherd never abandons his sheep. How much more will the chief shepherd not abandon his under shepherds? The ones he's appointed to care for the sheep. The ones who are to be stewards of the sheep. How much more will the chief shepherd fight for us, defend us, be there for us and with us in whatever we might face in our church situation? That may be the most important lesson I learned as I looked back after 5 years and stayed. The chief shepherd never abandoned me. And I assure you, in my darkest moments, there's times I felt abandoned and forsaken. Maybe like you do. But he never abandoned me. He had a plan all along, even in the darkest, hardest moments. The chief shepherd never abandons his sheep. He's using everything that's happening to us and in our ministries and all the difficulties and the struggles and the sufferings to make us more like Jesus, to make us more like the pastors he wants us to be. What will produce an empathetic pastor towards hurting people is usually when we've hurt a whole lot already. And that makes a really faithful shepherd. So there's the 5 lessons, and I want to just give you a quick update on where we are. I told you about the first 5 years. Let me give you just a glimpse of what we look like 15 years into this. It might surprise you. Last Sunday, I preached to 75 people. 6 of those people, there were 4 who were there, but there are only 6 remaining members when I got there 15 years ago now. 75 people. We are barely making a budget, an annual budget of $112,000, which included a pay cut for me because we needed to cut something. There I have no rich people in my church. There's not one person that makes a 6-figure income in my church. It's just where we are. People are faithful to give. It's just who we are. It's where people are. So you know what? If you came here and you pastor what people call a smaller church, I just want you to know you're in good company. 15 years later, 75 people. And I assure you, in some SBC circles, that is a failed ministry. Because my numbers didn't just keep soaring, which is so often how success is viewed in ministry. Let me tell you a couple other things about this group of people 15 years later. That's 75 people. There are 5 different generations present in our church out of that 75 people. There's 2-month-olds and there's a 96-year-old. 5 different generations. And there is an ethnic diversity that exists that was not possible 15 years ago. It's predominantly white still, but we have refugees that have come in from North Africa and others that have become members in the church. There's an ethnic diversity that's very encouraging. And so when I read Titus 2 and I see the makeup of a church, it's supposed to be multi-generational and multi-ethnic. It doesn't say about how big or small it's supposed to be. So out of those 75 people, we have 5 different generations and a growing ethnic diversity. In 15 years, we have trained up and raised up and sent out 4 different families to the mission field around the world. We have trained, raised up, and sent out 22 families into pastoral ministry around the world. We're about to send our 23rd next month, Lord willing, to South Dakota, actually. So South Dakota people, I'd love to talk with you after, so I can get your name and connect him to you. One of the ways to not increase the numbers of your church is to send a lot of people out, I have you know. But that's what I feel like the local church is supposed to be. A place that raises people up and sends them out and multiplies in that way. So our church is a sending church. And we continue to raise people up and send them out throughout the world if God calls them there. But if I continue to do that, probably our congregation is going to remain smaller and we're going to struggle financially. But I have watched God for 15 years as we've raised people up and sent them out. He sends others. And we continue on. I give this example to you because I want to encourage you that the faithfulness of your ministry is not based on numbers or money. And I don't know about your circles, but in mine, that's so much how success is measured in church life. And that is just not so, in my opinion, because God is not remotely impressed by our numbers or how much money we have. Let's evaluate our churches based on spiritual health and vibrancy. And that's what revitalization is all about. It's not about growing the church to a certain size. It's about breathing life back into a church that's dead. It's about seeing spiritual vibrancy in the people who are there. So if you're here and you're struggling because all the voices around you are telling you you just need to grow bigger or you need to figure out a way to get more money, I think God has a different understanding of success and faithfulness in our churches. And I just want to encourage you in that. Persevere through all the hostility and the adversity and the struggle. And let's change the paradigm on how we understand if God is truly at work and there's life being breathed back into a church. So I want to take a minute and pray for you and pray for your individual church that God would encourage you that maybe you are not the failure that you have been convinced that you are in your ministry. Maybe indeed there's more life there than you even realized. And if there is struggles there, changes that need to be made, that God would give you grace to see what those are. But I'm completely convinced that the Word of God is what breathes life into our souls and life back into churches. And that God will give you the grace to minister that and rely upon that. Let me pray for you in that way. Lord, thank you for the way that you care for us, the way that you are at work in us and through us. Lord, thank you for the call of each man and woman that's here and what they're doing, sacrificing to give themselves to the work of the ministry to serve Christ. Lord, would you encourage each person that's here and meet them exactly where you need to meet them? Lord, we know there are people who have pastored 2 years here at churches or 20 years. We pray, Lord, you would meet them and encourage them in the work that you have done through them. And Lord, use this as a time to reflect on the evidences of grace that are in each ministry represented here. But then, Lord, would you give us a resolve to commit ourselves to Christ, to preach the gospel, to minister your word, to shepherd the flock of people you have given us. And Lord, remind us that you're pleased with our faithfulness, not our gimmicks or our strategies. And that you would help us know that and know how to apply that into our churches and ministries. And Lord, we thank you that the chief shepherd never abandons us as his under shepherds. And we pray this in his name. Amen.